Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session on how a multi-model approach simplifies your architecture. So this is about architecture, and I see all you people out here. I want to ask you a question. How many people would like to just skip architecture and go to coding? All right, a few of you guys. I know you're an architect, though. I know that. So anyway, so I'm Frank Rubino. I'm a solutions director at MarkLogic, and my background's very much has been so far in media and publishing, but I've done some work helping MarkLogic customers transform their businesses and build MarkLogic applications in a number of different industries. And with me here today, as I mentioned, it's an architecture talk. I've got Amie Brown. And Amie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Amie Brown. I'm Director of Enterprise Architecture at Pearson. I lead a few different areas. One is our content platform architecture, our API strategy, and also our UX architecture strategy. And as we go through this deck today, I think it'll make a whole lot more sense why I'm covering those three domains and why they're so important to Pearson. I've been with Pearson for 9 years. I've been really mobile throughout the company. I've moved around a lot. I moved into the content architecture space a couple years ago. A little bit about where my passion lies. I follow a lot of Web 3.0, 4.0, 5.0 type trends. I think these linked data strategies that allow us to connect information from lots of different sources is going to be really powerful as it relates to learning and education. It's a long road for us, but we've started with adoption of MarkLogic.
So could you tell us a little bit about Pearson, Amie?
So Pearson was born in the 1840s. We started out as an engineering company. The picture on the lower left of the slide is the Blackwall Tunnel that runs under the River Thames in East London. We're responsible for building that tunnel. Over the years, Pearson started pursuing acquisitions in different industries, including publishing and broadcasting. We acquired the Financial Times, The Economist, Penguin Publishing, lots of different sort of media publishing type companies. And as of late, we identify ourselves as the world's learning company. We've become uber focused on education. We recently sold off the Financial Times. And I think one other thing to point out, and it's hard to see, you'll see it more on the next slide, but we've undergone a whole new branding strategy. So the P up in the left-hand corner actually symbolizes three things. There's a question mark, an exclamation mark, and the blue is a thumbprint. The question mark is to symbolize curiosity. We want to inspire our users, our customers, our learners, our instructors to be curious. The exclamation mark represents excitement about where we're headed. And the thumbprint is an acknowledgement of individuality. And just like many of you, personalization is really important to us in making sure that we're delivering on our promise to improve efficacy.
I saw there was something in the news recently about a partnership between Pearson and someone else.
Yeah, so just like H&R Block, we have forged a partnership with IBM to integrate the Watson capability into our higher ed Revel digital product platform. This came from a recent press release, announcing this partnership. And what we're doing there is we've pulled in a cognitive tutoring capability into this higher ed learning experience to enable learners to engage with Watson through a QA dialogue. My part of this story is that as part of the content platform, we need to define our content, our assets, and the relationships between our assets in a really rich semantic way that can power machine learning and cognitive capabilities downstream. The technology we've chosen behind our content platform is MarkLogic.
So multi-model is in the title of this presentation. So what do we mean by multi-model? So with multi-model, we usually are referring to a data store that can handle triples, documents, and some structured content, which might be tables or even structured documents. And it gives you this kind of operational cohesion, so you can do your security, your HA, and your other operational concerns can be handled with one component. And the data that is frequently stored in multimedia, sort of multi-model databases, is kind of something that looks like this. And Amie, I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about the data that is important to Pearson.
Yeah, so many of you, I mean, with having a technology background or might be familiar with the Addison Wesley brand. We published the Gang of Four Design Patterns book. We're involved in a lot. Pearson as a brand hasn't traditionally been understood. You might not have known that you had a textbook that was published by them. We're in lots of different fields. So what we deliver is curriculum. And now in this digital age, the kind of content you start to see in the curriculum is instructional, narrative content, and assessment. In a digital delivery model, you have lots of immersive, engaging experiences to deliver assessment, to deliver interactives. The kinds of assets you might see in our digital curriculum are flashcards, timeline widgets. You might see really rich physics simulations. You might start to see some gamification. The possibilities are really endless to improve engagement through these really rich interactive experiences. And then, when you start to talk about assessments, you think about multiple choice questions, fill in the blank, essay, and what we're able to do with understanding how a student is interacting with that assessment and where they might be struggling is a lot of what we look at.
So the semantic data connects not only items in an assessment, but the student's relationship to the instructional material as a whole.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So let's start with where we are beginning to build this kind of immersive, adaptive experience that makes use of all these different kinds of data. So I understand that at Pearson, there is semantics and meaning that's tied up in application code. So there's presentation and instructional data kind of intertwined. Mm-hmm. There are those kind of relational schemas, like we've seen those that run down hallways and, those kind of entity relationship diagrams. And there's a bunch of ETL and transformation.
Mm-hmm. So this diagram makes the ecosystem look really simple.
Yeah.
And it really looks more like that. And many of you might be able to relate to something like that. And the reason it looks like that isn't because somebody made a huge mistake and didn't follow an architecture strategy. The reason it looks like that is because over the course of over 100 years of redefining who we are and through acquisition, we've wound up with a polyglot landscape. Lots of different tech stacks. Standards still aren't super mature around education and semantic representations for how we drive to the future where these Web 5.0 intelligent personal agents and machine learning and AI capabilities start to surface. So what we've got here is we've got lots of different data repositories, lots of different data representations, lots of different tools involved in transformation. I mean, I'm pretty sure you all can relate to this, especially if you work for a large company that has gone through acquisition. And then on the delivery side, you have your branded product and you have your players that are trying to surface media assets or narrative assets, or now in the digital space, rich interactives. And how do you like rein this in? How do you break this down and take steps forward?
And how do you add new products, and how do you extend the products that you have without jumping through all these loopy-doopy hoops of integrating all this stuff point to point?
Change is hard.
Yeah.
Change is really, really hard and time-consuming.
So you went through a design and business direction planning process, which we'll talk about in a little bit of detail later, and you came up with the idea that you needed a platform, a single platform, to manage the relationships between metadata and content. And what were the business drivers for that decision?
Yeah, so I sort of summed up, these aren't like really official, but I sort of summed up what's driving our technology strategy, what's really important, and how can MarkLogic fill that void. So the ability to discover content more easily, not just for our learners and our instructors, but for our editors. Way upstream when we're trying to build these products, how can we allow them to tap into this rich repository of assets and look at analytics around these assets? How do we distribute content more efficiently? How do we streamline the production pipeline that's so heavily based on print and adopt some of these software best practices? And how do we make sure that we deliver the right content to the student at the right time? Those are the things that you know, we're working through. We're trying to solve with this metadata and content model. So describing our content using, we've adopted some open source ontologies to help drive to the future and leave the door open for future use cases based on discovery. And how do we semantically represent our content to also help make our content discoverable?
And there also is the concern of being able to mine all that content and understand its provenance and reconstruct the pieces of content later on in analytics processes down the road. And without a single platform that extends beneath the entire enterprise and the whole processes, all the processes, you can't really do that.
Right.
You're kind of stuck with the previous situation of then having to draw more lines and make more boxes on that diagram.
Yeah, so simplified architecture is really what we're after. And I think it's worth noting, I mean, that the ed tech market is really big. There's a lot of pressure coming from the ed tech market. Lots of niche, focused groups that are focused on simulations. They do simulations really well, or they build these widgets really well, and they're in these pockets. And then we have the big tech companies that we all know about that are also getting in the education space. But I think what Pearson brings to the table is we're uber focused on education. It's our space. We're not focused on cloud infrastructure. We're not trying to take over that market. We're not focused on placement and employment companies. We are focused on education. We have lots of established partnerships with authors, with instructors, teachers, researchers, learners that we can build upon.
Yep. So we have a siloed situation, and we have a decision to do a platform solution to address that, and we have some business goals that we're trying to attain with that solution. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit what the whoops, no, let's not go that way. Must hold the thing the right way. All right, so that same process by which we defined the business goals and we decided on a platform strategy, it led to a choice, a technology choice, technology stack choice. Mm-hmm. And the technology stack is based by MarkLogic, which has a document store and a triple store combined. So can you talk a little bit about the capabilities of those, especially that have to do with the data domains and the relationships of the data that are addressed by the capability of having a document store and a triple store combined?
Yeah, so a couple of things that are really important to us still have to do with structure. The structure of the pedagogy, the order in which we need to learn, and describing that order and adopting ontologies that define that order, but allow that order to be extended and customized. So using the triple store, the RDF store, to tackle that is something that we decided to pursue. And the document store is how we can cope with all the different kinds of content that we have. And I think it's worth noting, and this sort of ties into the importance of architecture, is we have a really rich established data architecture group that I work with closely that is starting to pursue ideas around ontology governance, ontology management in repositories, generating documentation to expose those data shapes and those ontologies so that when we build our APIs, we can feed off of those data shapes, and there's cohesion behind and high fidelity between what was authored and what surfaces through an API, so that then we have a really clean story about how we query things. And you extend that into the UX landscape, and you start to, this idea of going to a dev portal and building a web page and pulling in these widgets that are backed by these APIs, that are powered by a cohesive query, fixed data shape. It's all discoverable. You start to move really fast, and you start to promote consistency around your architecture strategies. So this sort of ties back to me pointing out that I'm driving content strategy, I'm driving UX architecture strategy, I'm driving our API strategy. I think they're so connected. I think the data that surfaces through the API that ultimately surfaces through a UX component, it's a really connected story.
And then when you start to add later the drive toward analytics, knowing where that content and efficacy, how that content has traveled through the system, is essential and affected by the fact that you've got this common taxonomy, common ontology that allows you to trace all the pieces through the process.
Definitely the value of the audit trail in deprecating all those systems responsible for transformation, ease us in the concern of understanding what's happened to this content, how has it been used.
But it doesn't just happen, right? I mean, we said this talk was about architecture. So how does Pearson do the architecture that makes that happen?
So I lead enterprise architecture in those three domains that I talked about. This diagram came out of Gartner in terms of a common adopted model for how architecture at different levels engages with business direction planning. And so what this describes is the enterprise architect working with our business strategy team at a strategic and contextual level, all the way through logical and across multiple solutions. And we drive viewpoints, as I'm articulating up here on the stage, we drive this vision, and we drive it down through application architecture, and we drive it down through solution architecture. And then we deliver and execute that against that in a physical way through solution architecture.
Yeah, so there's a group of, so you're in the enterprise architecture group, so you're in that big pink square there. Who else is there with you?
So I have 4 or 5 other peers that I work really closely with. And one of them is responsible for identity and access management. So they cover how do we deal with identities? How do we deal with authentication, authorization? They're thinking about our SSO strategy, data sovereignty. So we're an international company, and we're going to be affected by Brexit. So thinking about partnering with data privacy in our CISO group, that's a lot of the concern of identity access management architecture. Content architecture is my realm, and it's how do we create, what are the toolings and what's the technology that we need to create content that surfaces through our digital platform? And how do we make sure that it's compatible with the tech stacks, the digital product tech stacks that are serving our content. Operations architecture really pair nicely with our tech ops strategy. So, what is our cloud presence? To which regions are we deploying our cloud-based applications? What does our PaaS strategy look like? What technology do we use to automate? Data architecture is probably the one group that I work most closely with, because they're not only focused on data warehouse, data lakes, and analytics, they're also focused on how all of these groups work together around build upon common ontologies and governance. Product architecture is our digital product platform, so I'm talking to them too, because our content is actually streamed out through those platforms. Integration architecture is part of what I lead as the API strategy. That's, as a content provider, what does it look like, not only for our back office systems to integrate, but what does it look like for us to integrate with our partners and LMSs?
Cool. So, so we've gone through the decision to build a we've got the silos, which we've analyzed. We've gone through a decision to build a platform. We've talked about the team that the process that pushes the business direction, that drives the business direction toward the architecture, and then the architecture team that puts that together. So I want to back up a little bit and talk about what came out of the business planning step. Let me go back the right direction. So can you talk a little bit about what the business direction planning yielded and how that's going to relate to some of the architecture processes and data domains that we'll get into?
Yeah, so I use a language here that deserves explanation. Single learner model versus multi-learner model. So single learner model is where we're coming from, where we've been, and we've been there with textbooks. It's the idea of printing a textbook and distributing it to everybody, assuming everybody learns the same way. So single learner style. The past couple of years, we've done some really awesome things around an investment in native experiences, web experiences, pulling in really rich media. We've done some cool things around adaptive bitrate streaming and optimizing for mobile. We support schools in South Africa, so going offline, pulling that content offline onto the device. We've really invested in architecture to help make that possible. So you get a really cool experience, but it's still targeted at that one style of learning. What we're thinking about a whole lot now is basically at the topic of this talk, is multi-model and metadata and content and how to semantically represent them so that we can actually respond to different styles of learning on the fly at runtime.
So by single learner model, it's not a single person. It's actually meant to indicate something different. It's almost like a broadcasting kind of model where you've got the information and you're broadcasting one signal to anyone who's within range, versus the other side of that, which has some icons on there, which I guess you talked about a little bit, the film strip and the
audio.
The audio, right. So multi-learner model is really about how many different styles of learning there are, how many different paths there are through the same kind of, as soon as I say same, I'm wrong, but how many different paths there could be through the educational material.
Yeah, so defining it as a graph versus a linked list is really what we're talking about.
Yep. So as you develop these, we could start to talk about a couple of personas and use cases.
Yeah, so I feel like we've spent the time up to now kind of talking in the abstract, and I think a good way to start getting deeper into what do the models look like, what does the data look like, is to tee up a couple of primary use cases. So the first one is really focused on the editorial teams. And this is where I think we've gotten really good at Pearson. I think this is where MarkLogic has been really relevant. When we start to talk about the customers and the opportunities there are with the customers, that's where I don't think we've fully embarked on that, but we've started as part of that IBM engagement. But so Meredith here is an editor. She's tasked with building out a course. She wants to tap into Pearson's rich repository of data. And so how can we help her build a rich curriculum? She knows what the learning objectives are that she wants to achieve within this particular course. And so we want to use metadata to help her discover the content, and we want to surface the content as from our document store. The other big use case is Abigail. Abigail's the learner. She's studying psychology. She's struggling. She's taking all these self-study quizzes. She's not succeeding. She doesn't know what to do next. What sort of remediation opportunities can we provide to Abigail so that she can be successful in meeting her efficacy goals? And how do we do that? We do that through personalized learning.
So it's real interesting here to me is that these are almost two different worlds, right? The editorial world and the learner world, and yet there is some real benefit to them both using the same content store and the same model for understanding what that content is.
Yes, and that comes at a huge financial advantage. Like if we can create the same APIs, the same data shapes to power those discovery queries and just simply add access control policies around the data,
yep.
That's a really good proposition.
So let's go in detail a little bit about what these learning what the data models are. What is the domain? What are the data domains that you guys are working with? So
the three primary models that we're working with we refer to as the context model, the content model, and the learn model. And I took these screenshots because I thought it would be a good place to start and it would be something that would be familiar to all of you. The context model is the structure of a course. If you look at the sociological perspective, the biological perspective, and you look deeper into our back-end systems, what you'd find is two semantic representations related through triples based on the ontologies that we adopt to convey sequence or prerequisites. That is often known as the TOC. The other model, the learn model, is where we manage the educational objectives of that particular context. And typically, the subject matter expert defining this is the instructional designer working with the author to define a set of goals. And there we have triples that define the relationships between the objectives. And we subtype those objectives depending on at what level they're mapped to our content. And then we have our content model, which we base a lot on. We try to adopt open source ontologies. So we lean on schema.org to help us define the content assets themselves. In this particular case, I give a paragraph example of some structured narrative text. I think, the context model is really relevant to our business today. I think if you look years down the road, you start, and we get into this fully customer focused, personalized learning platform, that we start to see that be derived or inferred based on what we know about the student, what our learning objectives are, what that graph looks like, and what content we have at our disposal. But based on where we're at now, we still define a structure, but we define it as a graph to allow for that customization.
So you're saying that the context model is something that is very useful today because it's almost like when you and I have spoken, I've understood it almost to be like a kind of a bridge between the book-based beginnings of all this content and instructional theory and pedagogy, and the future, which is, as you describe it, much more dynamic, much more adaptive and fluid.
Exactly. So it is a graph. We are adopting ontologies. We are basing it on a semantic model, and that gives us the extensibility we need. I need a drink.
Okay.
All right. Ready for?
Okay. So this is a little bit more of a detailed view of it. Well, more of a conceptual view of the objects and relationships. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah. So this is definitely a conceptual view, and it's expressed as a Venn diagram. And I think it's really interesting as we talk about multi-model, and I'd like to talk through the intersections of each of these models. So you can imagine, we have the context model, content model, learn model. The intersection of the content model with the context model might satisfy some queries that are looking for, provide me with all of the video assets contained within this course. So that would be the intersection of the top two models.
Yeah.
That might be beneficial for rights clearance purposes, or an editor that's looking for video assets within a particular title. And then we have the intersection of the content model and the learn model. So I also might want to look for a particular set of assessment assets that align to a particular learning objective. And then we might have the intersection of the context model with the learn model. So now with it, the context in today's world is really the course or the book. I imagine going forward it will look different. It might look like a subscription to a particular set of content. But right now, it's defined as the title or the book. So I might want to look at, perform a query that identifies all of the learning objectives which within a particular part of a particular book or across an entire title. And then you have the intersection of all three models, where I might be looking for assets, narrative assets, so that's going to be my content model, that align to a particular learning objective or set of learning objectives or a top goal contained within a particular context. So really the way we work today within a particular context to keep a project going and moving and understand the status of a project is benefited by querying across these models and understanding how far we've gotten.
So I noticed schema.org on there, and you've mentioned it a couple of times. Can you talk about why that's important to this model?
Yeah, so one of the things that was really important to us was to adopt open source ontologies, to leave the door open for discoverability of our assets, to not create a proprietary ontology unless our business cases justified us building one. So we do extend some of these ontologies to better suit our business. And I mean, recently I saw schema.org in its latest draft version. It's starting to provide a definition for a course, and they're starting to define standards in the education space, and we'll continue to try to adopt them. But I think we believe it's in our best interest to use open source ontologies the best we can for discoverability. And many of you in different markets are doing it for SEO and promoting content that you're putting out on the web.
And then I had another couple, like the goal framework. Is that something that Pearson has developed yourselves? You guys have a goal framework that is defined as? So
most of, and my depth of knowledge in instructional design, it's kind of limited, but most disciplines and districts and states have their own standards for what students have to achieve at a certain grade level, or within psychology, or even where you have high-stakes assessments driving curriculum. And so what we try to do when we're producing a product is align our assets to those objectives and make them discoverable and unify that domain.
Right. Okay, so this is the conceptual view. So what I'd like to do, and you and I talked about it, so we'll go into looking at a couple of queries. So this is a query that I think it lives in Meredith's world, no?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what's going on here and how we're going to?
Yeah, and I got the 5-minute alarm, so let's race through this. But
no, we're not
definitely.
Race through this. We got a few minutes.
So first use case, and I sort of spoke to this with the Venn diagram, is find all content modules. So now I'm looking particularly at a level in the graph for content modules that instruct what are the nervous system neurons and nerves and how do they relate to one another. And that has part narrative work. So I'm looking for something that has instructional and narrative content that's aligned to that particular objective. And then you start to see the full text search need. I'm looking for something, I'm an editor, and I want to find something that speaks to brain-computer interfaces. So on the left side, you see the RDF store. This is still very logical. It's much more sophisticated than this, but so that you get an understanding of what this looks like, we are using a controlled vocabulary to relate these different kinds of assets and these different kinds of objects. And that helps us for querying capability. So I might expose a RESTful API based on HTTP verbs, but I'll know how to translate that into something that is targeted and optimized using Sparkle queries across the multiple models of our MarkLogic solution. And then you see an example of the text, of the JSON object that's contained within the doc store. And then the result being likely a URN with some metadata to the asset that you've discovered so that the learning experience can surface that content module.
And then what's interesting here too is that first part of that query, find me the content modules that instruct that particular learning objective. That has multiple results, but then and you may want to present those as well. But once you start applying the guardrails of the additional constraints, that's kind of where you want to kind of point the user, and that's what makes it effective to create these kind of multi-model queries where you can, because Meredith might say, okay, well that's a great module, and I want to rewrite it or reuse it so I can align it with something different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah.
Very powerful.
Okay, so now we got another one more.
Yeah. So another example that I could see it applying to Meredith's curation and collation of a course, but we learned about Abigail, and she's struggling with her content, and she's not doing very well with her assessments. So the digital product platform determines that they should give her some remedial content. And now as she experiences this remedial content, we also learn that she does really well with assessments that contain multiple choice questions, that we're able to get the best data back when we present her with that kind of assessment. So you can imagine the content platform surfacing an API backed by MarkLogic that allows the digital product platform algorithm to make a request for an assessment item that's aligned to that learning objective that's of that particular type. And here I show an example of some JSON data that represents a multiple choice question that might test her on her knowledge of that particular learning objective.
So let's talk just a second about what would happen if you didn't have a multi-model approach behind this. You would have to do, and okay, so guys, I want you to shake your hands a little bit, if you can. If you're not holding soda or something like that, because I want you to follow along with me. If you do not have a multi-model approach at the data level, you have to do joining, you have to do sorting, and you have to do, this is the hard part, filtering on the application layer, which means that between all of these operations, all of these parts of the query, you've got some user experience problems because you got some latency and some lag time. And that's another reason why using multi-model is effective.
Yep. And I acknowledge,
I don't know if I saw you do this whole thing.
I definitely can do that.
All right.
Not when all the attention in the room is on me.
Okay. So we've got, so let's take a look at how all this stuff comes together in the ecosystem, today's ecosystem, or maybe a couple of months from now.
Yeah. So this is taking a step back, right, and looking at the whole. So one of the things really important to us is to separate data from presentation. Like, really important. We want to be able to parallelize our agility in our brand. I started this off telling you that we were defining a new unified brand. We want to be able to change that. Ideally, in the future, we don't want to have to go back and edit and transform all of our content because of a new brand. We want to be able to move fast in both places. So we want to work with instructional designers, authors, professors, define our content in a way that can transcend all of the ways we can't even imagine that our content will surface in the future, whether it's through audio channels, through bots. We want to separate that, and that's really important. And what you see in this diagram is that separation. So you see the editorial teams using capabilities, authoring capabilities, and authoring the data, and ingesting. We work with media producers. We ingest those media assets, and we deliver them out through a media origin store and then through an edge caching capability. But our RDF graph and our narrative assets, we use MarkLogic. On the right-hand side is our UX. It's not just the CSS files. It is the JavaScript components. And so for us, we've made a big investment in JSON because those JavaScript components really like to work with JSON. And to simplify the architecture and to streamline production, we look for high fidelity between the data that's authored and the data that's composed to create a targeted learning experience. This is the 50,000-foot view. We use the NPM registry to manage our web assets. We use Bitbucket for source control. We do have a native presence. We have a really cool native story. And this is sort of that whole of the ecosystem. So you see composability and transformation happening at runtime. We pushed it all the way to the end so that we can make sure we can meet the needs of the learner at runtime.
Yeah. So what's next?
So I think you start to see more and more models. I think the models that we're focused on today have to do with the book, have to do with the structure, the learning objectives. I think you'll start to see student models layered on top of these models where we start to understand more about students and we're even able to meet their efficacy goals better. I think we start to see an analytics model. We start to close that feedback loop and learn about how our content's doing through our digital product experiences.
And we're thinking all these models are hosted in the content platform, and they're managed by the content platform and accessed by clients through APIs.
So that's to be determined. So that's future.
This is my vision.
And by the way, I don't have responsibility for the analytics model. So, or the student model. Those data points are collected downstream. But what I can tell you is that we're learning, we're growing, we're maturing, and increasing our MarkLogic footprint to support the models that we do know about.
Okay, so back to the summation. So this is our last slide, guys. Going back to where we started. We made a choice to have a platform solution. And we talked a bit about Pearson's data domains. We talked about the context model, the learn model, and the content model, and some of the other models that we may add later. We talked about some queries and some use cases, some personae. And what I want to know is how we think we did or are doing with this strategy against those goals that we set out earlier.
I think we're building the runway. I think we have the foundation. We feel really confident about our information architecture approach. We feel really confident about our vision. We're a really big company. I mean, we're 40,000 employees across 70 countries, lots of systems, lots of onboarding, lots of alignment. It's a multi-year effort. But we've got the vision right, and so now it's aligning the different groups towards this vision.
Well, I want to thank you guys very much, and we're interested. We've got some time for questions and discussion, so we will throw a microphone at you if you raise your hand. Yes, Dar. Okay. Okay, now, I'm going to toss this at you. So you might want to duck over there. Almost.
Wow.
Okay. No problem. Hello? Okay.
Yeah,
Very
great.
loud. Can you speak about the learn model that you described, how that is being created or curated in your content landscape?
So we actually have built a homegrown tool that targets the instructional designer persona, and we have systems, legacy systems that have a lot of that data. So we've also invested in migrating that data, but we rely on the instructional designer as the subject matter expert to drive the tooling to collect that data, and so it's keyed in.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Yes. So Dar, you want to toss it back to that gentleman?
I noticed with everything you got going on there, you still had DOC for your authors. Are you moving people away from Word and onto web platform for authoring as well, perhaps on top of MarkLogic, or primarily in doc and then transform?
So the reality is a lot of the material we're getting from our authors is starting in a Word doc or Adobe InDesign or something like that, but we are making an investment to create our own authoring tools because we really want that data to come in the way we want it, but we're also investing in transform capability because, like I said, it's a long, drawn-out effort, so we can't just start new. We have to still support our business where it's at. So we're going to have to do both, unfortunately.
Innovating and
Innovate
keeping,
and support.
Right, keeping the lights
Backward compatibility.
Right. Yes.
Hi, Amie. It was a great presentation. Are you using an LRS in your learning management platform that brings it back to the authoring?
No. So far, where that comes into play is when we talk about our partnerships with Blackboard. Like we've gotten out of the LMS space. That's what our lead product. Actually, I'm from Denver, and I started as part of eCollege, so I'm really familiar with the LMS space and the integration strategies there. So because we're uber focused on education, content, and the learn model, we haven't, as far as I know, something might be happening on the digital product space that I just am not aware of, but I don't think we've made a deliberate investment in trying to solve for the LRS.
Okay.
Anybody else? I have a question, since no one's asking. How does, just to wrap up, I think it's going to be the wrap-up question, and it's not going to be a conversation that we can end right here, but how do microservices architecture trends push against or complement this idea of a content platform?
Yeah, so that's a super exciting question to answer. So I feel like, and because I've recently taken on this API space, we talk a lot about microservices and how to automate, and there are platforms out there like Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes that help enable speed to market of these microservice-based architectures. But when you look at that, you look at a denormalized architecture. You look at being able to deploy multiple services redundantly within, like in the case of Kubernetes, a single pod. And you create like this own small network so that they can talk to one another. Right. And it's redundant, it's denormalized, it sort of deviates from the purest architecture principles of separation of concern, and the same kind of thing that happened when we moved away from the relational model into the NoSQL model of denormalizing data, because we had these really aggressive SLAs to deliver rich experiences.
Right.
And I feel like what we're seeing in terms of denormalization strategies in the middle tier is what multi-model is at the persistent tier. It's denormalizing your data for the sake of your user experience and simplifying your architecture. So I feel like it's very similar strategies, but it's at different tiers.
Yeah, okay, interesting. Anybody else? Any other thoughts, questions? All right, well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, guys.